Okay, thanks.
Somebody asked what the level of the webinar is for. It's actually 100, 200, 300. I mean, it's 400 if you get in and want to figure out exactly everything about all of the scripts. But if you just want to use the scripts, it's a 100. So
Yeah, it definitely varies.
depends on how much you want to dig into it. Okay, I'm going to start. Good morning. This is DBA Fundamentals with our first session in April. Today we have Glenn Berry doing his famous session, Dr. DMV's Troubleshooting Toolkit. I've got a few housekeeping things to go over first, and we'll get back to Glenn in just a minute. We have a sponsor, Century One, that has great products and great free stuff that they like to give away. If you want to look at this screen, and up at the top right hand side there's a little camera. Click on that. It'll keep you a copy of it so you can go check out some of the stuff they've got. Definitely you have to try out the Plan Explorer. It's fantastic for looking at execution plans, but there's plenty of other things. Virtual group news. More information about our SQL Slack channel. We gave away a $350 Amazon gift card to Timothy Perando, and he said it was fine for us to use his name. Just wanted to let you know we've started a new one. Every session that you attend gets you one entry, either here or in Australia for our Down Under chapter, April, May, and June. PASS has multiple virtual groups. Practically every major language and practically every major type. Check out the website at SQLpass.org. It may have changed, but that'll get you there. And navigate, look at different chapters, and join them. Virtual group meetings that we have coming up, I'm just going to go over the initial one. Glenn is actually talking for us again in our Down Under chapter next week, analyzing I/O subsystem performance. That should be a very good one. Then we've got Brent Ozark coming in April 18th. Virtual group meetings for us, you'll see that in our email, but we've got a lot of them scheduled through September. Virtual group meetings that are highlighted other people are having. Security has a real good one coming up on the 6th. Saturday Night SQL has another one coming up that will preview SQL Server in the vNext public preview. It's coming up in June. And I see questions saying, okay, no sound.
Yeah, they lost you for a second.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. My VoIP has been having trouble. I'm going to try to do it by phone next time. The upcoming SQL Saturdays. If you've never been to a SQL Saturday, it's like a small PASS summit. If you've never been to a PASS summit, it's a lot of speakers, probably between 10 and 50, giving free sessions. You have to pay for your lunch, and that's about it. Vendors pay for everything, and a lot of vendor freebie stuff, and you get to just meet everybody in your area. It's a great networking opportunity, great education opportunity. Go to SQLSaturday.com and check it out. Our sessions are being recorded. You can, again, like I said, do the camera at the top right hand side. You can get to our YouTube channel and join that, and you'll know exactly when the sessions are uploaded, or you can go to our meeting archive and download scripts. Okay, I'm going to introduce Glenn. Glenn is with SQL Skills. He's been doing the DMVs for quite a while now. I don't know exactly when he started. What was it, about 2009, 2010, something like that?
Yeah, it's 2009.
And he keeps them up to date all the time. So these scripts are fantastic, and you can pull it up for practically any version you want, except for maybe 2000, 2005. So he keeps them up to date, and he brings in all the latest, greatest things that each version comes out with. I'm going to let him talk about the rest of it, so I'm going to turn it over to you, Glenn.
All right, thanks, Steve. So this is Glenn Berry with SQL Skills. I'm skipping the normal PowerPoint that I do in the interest of time here, but this is actually my SQL Server 2016 diagnostic queries for April of 2017. And I have separate versions of these queries for each major version of SQL Server, going back to SQL Server 2005 and going out to SQL Server vNext. And where you can get these, that's always the first question, is just Google Glenn Berry DMV. They're hosted on my blog at SQL Skills, and they're completely free, and I update them each month for all the active versions of SQL Server. Another thing I wanted to point out real quickly is SQL Skills, we have a bunch of what we call SQL 101 blog posts that we started about a month ago. We've already got 15 of them out there, and especially for this group, we go through a lot of different subjects at a 101 level, so you might want to check out this link and just read some of those blog posts. So anyways, these queries are designed to let you look at an instance of SQL Server and see how it's configured from the instance level, drilling down through the hardware and storage, and looking at an individual database. And they're really handy when you're starting a new job as a DBA, for example, and you've got a bunch of strange SQL servers that you didn't set up. Or if you're a consultant, they're really handy for looking at customer systems. And so we're just going to start going through these. There's 80 of them in this set, and we'll see how many I can get through before we run out of time. But what you'll notice here is we start off with instance level queries. And for these instance level queries, it doesn't matter what database you're connected to. But other ones in the set later on are database specific, so you want to make sure you're connected to a particular database that you care about rather than the master database. And all these queries are numbered, and they have a short title here, and then there's a slightly longer description. And you'll also notice that there's 6 dashes underneath each one because there's people in the community who go through and write PowerShell scripts and C# executables to parse and run these queries automatically and save the results in Excel, for example. So that's what that's about. So I'm going to go ahead and run this, and I'll go through and just sort of explain the results. This first one is just telling me the server name and then giving me all the detailed information about SQL Server, so I know what build it's on, what service pack, what cumulative update, the fact that it's developer edition, and I even get some information off the operating system. I'm running on Windows 10 Pro on my workstation here. So that's really good to know. And you'll notice that I have lots of comments and links underneath most of these queries. So I have a little build chart that shows you all the publicly available CU builds. So I'm on the very latest CU for SQL Server 2016 Service Pack 1 right here. And that's good. There's been a lot of hot fixes on the Service Pack 1 branch. This CU had over 100 hot fixes, and a lot of them are really important. And I also want to point out a blog post that I wrote just recently that points out some of the more important fixes in the Service Pack 1 build. So this is a good link to look at. And Microsoft recommends that you proactively install CUs. They changed that guidance about a year ago. So I really urge people to try to stay up to date on their CUs. So anyways, going on, the next one is going to read the SQL Server Error Log and tell us what's going on with the hardware and the licensing. And so I've got one socket in my workstation with 4 cores and 8 logical processors, and SQL Server is using all 8 of those. And this is something they added in SQL Server 2012 SP3, and all newer builds of SQL have this feature that show this in the error log. But this will help you figure out what's going on with your licensing And I've run into a lot of customers lately who install SQL Server Standard Edition on a server with more than 24 cores, and SQL Server only uses the first 24 cores, and that can be a really big issue. And so this helps you detect if that's going on with you or not. And plus, it just tells you what's going on with your hardware anyways. All right, the next one in the set is server properties. And this is going to pull back a bunch of different server property calls to tell us a lot about our instance. So it shows the machine name and the server name. I have a named instance here, the instance name, whether or not it's a traditional failover cluster instance, again, the addition and all the information about the build, and then some other good stuff here, including the default data path for the instance and the default log path for the instance. And that's really important to know. A lot of people just leave this on the default of C program files, Microsoft SQL Server, which is not a good idea. And it's also really important that whatever this is, this path has to exist, because if it doesn't exist and you try to install a service pack or a CU, the database engine portion of that setup will fail at the very end, which is really annoying. So it's really important that whatever you say that default data path is actually exists on your system. All right, the next one in the set is instance level configuration values. So all the things that you can change with SP configure. Well, you can pull them back from sys.configurations, and depending on what version of SQL Server you have, you've got anywhere from the high 60s to 76 rows here on SQL Server 2016. And these are ones that I like to key in on. Backup checksum default, that's a new one for 2014 and newer. That should always be turned on, in my opinion. Backup compression default should be turned on most of the time, unless you have transparent database encryption on older versions of SQL Server. If you have SQL Server 2016, you can use backup compression and TDE together and still get good compression. Another thing I want to know about is the CLR enabled or not, the Common Language Runtime. I just want to know, is that enabled or not? Cost threshold for parallelism is another one. The default setting is 5, and for many workloads, that's too low. Raising it to a higher value makes queries have to be more expensive before they get parallelized, and quite often your server will run better if you raise it to a higher value. Another one that I key in on here is max degree of parallelism, and our guidance for that is you want to set that on a physical server to the number of physical cores in a NUMA node. So if you have an 8-core processor, you would set it to 8 as a starting value, especially with an OLTP workload. And the thinking behind that is you're trying to prevent an individual query from crossing NUMA nodes and doing foreign memory access. The next one I want to look at is max server memory. And this should be set to an appropriate value so you don't put the operating system under memory pressure. And it depends on what components you're running and what else is running on your SQL Server. And then finally, optimize for ad hoc workloads. I think that should pretty much always be enabled. It's a feature they added way back in SQL Server 2008, and hardly anybody uses it in my experience. But it helps minimize the plan cache bloat for ad hoc and prepared query plans that are very unlikely to be reused. All right, so, and then I've got notes here explaining most of these and explaining some of the new things that were added in SQL Server 2016. And also, this is a blog post that talks about how backup compression works really well with TDE-enabled databases. All right, the next one in the set, I want to find out what's going on with my global trace flags for the instance. And I've got 3226 enabled, and that's one that disables writing a backup success message to the SQL Server Error Log every time you run any kind of a backup that works. And if you turn this on, it doesn't do that anymore. It'll still do it if the backup fails, and you still have a record of the backup in MSDB, but turning this on makes your error log smaller and easier to find more important errors. Now, if you're running on older versions of SQL Server, there's other trace flags you might want to turn on, like 1118, for example, but 1118 is turned on by default in SQL Server 2016. And this blog post down here by Bob Ward explains that in much more detail. All right, the next one I want to find out is Windows Instant File Initialization enabled on the machine that this instance is running on. And it turns out, yes, it is. And this is something they added fairly recently, where they log this in the SQL Server Error Log every time SQL Server starts up. And this is something that I recommend that most people turn on. And you have to go in and grant the perform volume maintenance task right to the SQL Server service account to get this. And actually, there's a checkbox that you can check when you're installing SQL Server 2016 that'll do this for you. All right, the next one in the set is I want to find out what's going on with my memory inside of the SQL Server process. So this is going to show me my actual memory usage by SQL Server and a couple other interesting things. So first of all, this is how much memory SQL Server is actually using. And the fact that locked pages is above 0 tells me that I've got locked pages in memory enabled, which is a good idea for most people, by the way. And then these two flags here, you want them both to be 0. If either one of these is 1, that's an indication that SQL Server is under memory pressure internally. And to be honest, you don't see that very often, but that's just something you want to check out. All right, the next one in the set is I want to find out what's going on with my SQL Server services. And this only shows the database engine and SQL Server agent, and it also will show the browser in some cases, but it doesn't show things like analysis services or reporting services. But this shows me that they're both set to automatically start up and what their process ID is. They're both running. And very important, you want to know when the database engine last started, because it makes a lot of difference if you've been running just for a few hours or a day or two, or for many weeks or months, because that helps you interpret a lot of the other queries in this set by knowing that. Also, I want to know what my service account is. And also, this is a new one they added fairly recently that tells you that instant file initialization is enabled. So you want a yes there. And then if you were running in a failover cluster, it would tell you here and tell you what node you were running on. Okay, the next one in the set, I want to find out what's going on with my SQL Server agent jobs on this instance. So when I run this, you can see that I've got the Ola Hallengren maintenance solution enabled, which is a really good thing, by the way. It really makes your backups and your index maintenance and database integrity checks much easier to handle. And all my jobs are owned by SA, not an individual login. They're all enabled. I can tell if I've got a notify operator set up or not. And you can see the categories that I have these in. And you can see the next run date and next run time. So this gives you a real quick overview of all your agent jobs. All right, the next one in the set, I want to find out if I have any SQL Server agent alerts set up on this instance. And these are different from jobs. And a lot of DBAs don't even know these exist, by the way. But when certain bad things happen to SQL Server, you can see kind of the descriptions here: hardware errors, corruptions, crashes in the SQL Server process. You'll get a message in the SQL Server Error Log that you might not notice for a while. And if you set up an alert, you can have it so that when that bad thing happens, the alert fires, and you can do something like have an agent job run or have it send an email to a distribution list. So you find out that, oh yeah, this bad thing happened now, rather than maybe not noticing it for a week or two. And I have a script in my blog, if you go to this link right here, that will download a script that lets you create all of those. All you have to do is make sure you have a SQL operator set up and that the operator name matches what's in my script, and then it'll create all those alerts for you just in a few seconds. All right, the next one in the set is I want to know a little bit more about what's going on with Windows that I'm running on. And this shows me 6.3 and 48, and it's kind of cryptic, right? And 1033 is English. So I have charts down here that explain what 6.3 means. And it's sort of confusing. It could be several different possibilities here. And hopefully you're running on a server operating system in production. And then here's the SKUs. I'm running Windows 10 Professional Edition is what all that shows us. Okay, the next one in the set is I want to find out what's going on with my NUMA node information. And NUMA stands for Non-Uniform Memory Access, and all modern server machines support NUMA now, but I only have one socket in my workstation, so I have one NUMA node. And this tells me that, okay, I've got one NUMA node with 8 schedulers since I have 8 processor cores. And this is also really handy in a virtualization setting, because when you create a virtual machine, you have to say how many sockets and how many virtual CPUs per socket you want to set up. And this will show you what somebody did when they created the VM if you're running inside of a VM. And also this comes in handy if somebody has gone into the BIOS of a physical machine and disabled NUMA. then you'll just see one NUMA node here instead of multiple NUMA nodes, and that's not a good idea for SQL Server, by the way. All right, the next thing you want to know about is what's going on with memory at the operating system level. So when I run this query, this tells me, okay, I've got 64 gigs of RAM in my box, and I've got lots of available memory, and some information about the page file, which is really not that interesting, to be honest. But this one here is really interesting. System memory state. You want that to say available physical memory is high. That means the operating system is not under memory pressure. But what it might say, and I see this fairly often, is it'll say available physical memory is low or it's steady. And that means you're under external memory pressure. The operating system is under memory pressure, and it's setting a flag that tells SQL Server to release some memory. And if you have locked pages in memory set, SQL Server won't do that. But this is just an indication you probably have max server memory set too high, and or you're running other things that are eating up your operating system's memory. All right. These next ones are for if you have a traditional failover cluster instance, which I don't, but this would tell me some information about all the nodes in the instance and who owned it. So I'm just going to skip that. If I had an always-on AG cluster going here, then this would tell me some information about how it was set up, but I don't have that either on my workstation, so no results come back from that. The next one is if you're using availability groups, this one gives you a really quick and dirty overview of the health and status of your availability group and what's going on with your replicas. And I don't have that set up on my workstation, so I'm just going to skip that. But one thing I want to point out is that if you are using availability groups, SQL Server 2016 has a lot of low-level improvements that make them perform a lot better than they used to. And this blog post down here from Bob Ward explains that in a lot of detail. All right, the next one in the set, I want to find out what's going on with my hardware. And so this tells me a lot of information about my hardware. I've got one physical CPU, 8 logical CPUs, how much memory I have. It tells me again when SQL Server started. And also, this confuses a lot of people. They see hypervisor here, and they automatically assume they're running in a VM, and that may or may not be true. All this means is that there's a hypervisor running on the host. And in my case, I have Hyper-V running, but this particular instance of SQL Server is not in the hypervisor. It's running natively. So there's a way to figure that out later. This also tells me that automatic soft NUMA is not turned on because I don't have enough processor cores to do that. And then also this tells me that locked pages in memory is enabled. And that's a new feature they recently added, that particular column. Okay. The next thing I want to find out is, okay, who built this server? And in my case, I built the server. This machine I'm running on, I built from parts because I'm a big hardware geek. But in real life, this will tell you, you know, Dell PowerEdge R720 or HP, you know, DL580 Gen 9, whatever. And it's nice to know the manufacturer and model number of your server. And if you're running virtualized, it'll say VMware or Microsoft Hyper-V right here. And that's the indicator that you're actually running in a VM. Okay, the next one in the set, this is going to give me the BIOS date from the main system BIOS. And all the hardware vendors push out BIOS updates fairly often, and quite often they fix pretty severe issues. And if I run this on a server and I see a BIOS date from 3 or 4 or 5 years ago, that either means that the server is pretty old and or they just have not been maintaining it properly, which is not a good sign when I'm looking at somebody's system, that they're not staying up to date with their BIOS and firmware updates probably. All right, the next one in the set is going to tell me what's going on with my processors. What model exactly processor am I running? And if you're a major league hardware geek like me, you have most of these model numbers memorized. But if not, you can just Google whatever you find here, and it'll take you to the Intel Arc database probably, and you can get all the specifics about this processor. And this will help you figure out, is this an old, slow processor, or is it fairly modern and fast? And you also get some indication of what level of PCIe support you get and how much memory you can use with this. So it's a really good thing to know exactly what processor, because it always bothers me when I talk to a DBA and and I ask them, okay, what processor are you running in the server? And they're like, I don't know, I think it's a Xeon. You know, you should know exactly what Xeon you're running, you know, on your mission critical database servers, in my opinion. All right, the next one in the set is there's a new feature they added in SQL Server 2014 called buffer pool extension. And I don't have it enabled on this workstation, but what it does is it lets you set aside some space in your file system to cache clean buffer pool pages. And that lets you make your buffer pool look like it's larger than it actually is. And to be honest, it's not really a very interesting feature for Enterprise Edition because real memory is always going to be faster than your storage subsystem. But if you're stuck on Standard Edition, which has a very low memory limit, then you can use this feature to make your memory look like it's larger. And the scenario where this might help you is if you have a SAN with really poor random read I/O performance and you have an OLTP workload, then if you cache these clean buffer pool pages on very fast local flash storage on the node where this is running, then quite often you can get a nice performance boost if you have all those things set up correctly. So it's not very expensive to try out. It doesn't require enterprise storage necessarily, because if you lose this BPE file, you don't lose any data and you don't go down. So if you are using it, then you can run this query to look and see how you're using it and which databases are using it. But since I don't have it turned on, I'm just going to skip that. All right, the next one in the set, I want to find out if I had any memory dumps from SQL Server. And a memory dump by SQL Server means that SQL Server was pretty unhappy and was just short of crashing completely. And it'll generate a memory dump, and this tells you where that dump is and when it happened and how large the dump file is. And there's also a text file and a log file that goes with it that you can open up in a text editor. So you can open those up and see if you can figure out what the problem might have been. Or if you really know what you're doing, you can open up this dump file with a debugger and try to figure it out. But what most people are going to do is send this to Microsoft if you're seeing a lot of these. And the reason I was seeing a lot of these is SQL Server was a little bit unhappy on my machine a few weeks ago. But if you're seeing this on a production machine, that's an indication that things are not going very well, and you want to do more investigation. All right, next one, this is one I just added this month, is MSDB has a table called suspect pages. And when I run this, it comes back empty, which is good. But if you're running into certain kinds of errors, like 823 errors or 824 errors, or bad checksums or torn pages, well, it'll keep track of that. And if you're using database mirroring or availability groups, it'll try to automatically repair those. And when it does that, it will show that it did that in this table. And also, if you run dbcc check db with repair allow data loss, it'll go in and try to repair those. And this table is limited to 1,000 rows, and hopefully when you run this, this will be empty. But it's a good thing to look at periodically, because if you see rows in this table, that means something bad is going on probably with your storage subsystem that's causing these errors. All right, the next one, so I want to find out how many data files I have in my TempDB database. And in my case, I have 8. And they changed the SQL Server setup program to automatically create multiple TempDB files depending on how many cores you have in your system. And you can override that to have fewer or more. But the standard guidance that we give people is what Bob Ward talks about. Start off with 4 to 8 data files and then add more if you need to. And it's really important that they're all the same size. So this shows you, hey, I've got 8. All right, the next one going on here is I want to know how all my database files are laid out across my file system. So when I do this, it shows me all the databases in this instance and the name of the database, and then I can see the data file and the log file and where they're located. And then is percent growth is a setting for each database that should not be used, by the way. And so I can see that a few of these, mostly the Microsoft system databases, have it turned on. And I can see how big each of these files is. So this gives me a good high-level view of how all my files are laid out across my file system. All right, the next one, I want to find out what's going on with all my logical drives where I have any SQL Server database files. So when I run this, you can see that I've got 4 LUNs that have SQL Server database files on them. And you can see they're all NTFS, and I give logical volume names that help me understand what the underlying storage is. And then you can see how large they are and how much space I have available. And obviously, as a SQL Server DBA, you don't want to run out of space because that's bad. But even if you're getting low on space, that's bad because your performance tends to deteriorate both with magnetic drives and with flash drives for different reasons. So running low on space is a bad thing for multiple different reasons. Okay, the next one in this set I stole from Jimmy May, but I made a few little minor changes to it. And this is going to show me my latency by logical drive for all my SQL Server database files that live on that drive. And this is a little bit deceptive because this is showing you the latency on average cumulatively since SQL Server has been running. And this is not just your regular workload, it's also everything else that's touching your database files. So database backups, running DBCC check DB, doing index maintenance, any HADR activity that's hitting those files. All of that goes into this. So these numbers that you see here will quite often be higher than you see from other tools. So don't let that throw you. But this just is an indication that, hey, this seems a little bit high. 69 milliseconds seems a little bit high. And the reason why it's high for this R drive, even though it's fast flash storage, is because I was hammering it with some stuff before I started this session just to get a high number to look at. All right, the next one in the set is going to show me the same thing, but it drills down into the individual file level. So I know that I have an issue with the R drive, it looks like. So when I run this, now I see, hey, this database called no compression test that's on the R drive, its data file has 82.5 milliseconds of read stall latency. So that tells me something useful, that something was really hitting that database hard, and that's the particular file in that database on the R drive that's the main culprit. And you can see all my other numbers are quite low here, which I would expect with local flash storage. It's not really seeing a huge workload. All right, now the next one in this set is going to show me what's going on. Do I have any 15-second I/O warnings here? And it turns out I actually do have a few of them. And when you run this, this is looking at the SQL Server Err Log, and anytime you have an I/O that takes more than 15 seconds to complete, it writes it in the error log. And what you're looking for here, is there any kind of a pattern? Is this always happening at 3 a.m. when you're running database backups or DBCC check DB? Is it always happening on the same drive? Is it always happening with the same files from the same database? Or is it just all over the place at different times? Because if that's the case, that's really strong evidence that your storage subsystem is just performing pretty poorly. And it's really much harder for storage administrators or SAN administrators to blow that off like they might with some of these other metrics. So this is an important one to look at. Okay, the next one in the set, I want to get some very useful information about all the databases on this instance. And this is a pretty big query. But when I run this, it shows me all my databases, including the system databases, and it shows me what recovery model they're in and the fact they're all online. I'm not using partially contained databases. And then the log reuse weight description, that's really important to pay attention to as a DBA. If you're running in full recovery model, you want this to be nothing or log backup pretty much all the time, one of those two. But if you see something else like replication or database mirroring or active transaction, that means there's something going on that's preventing the log from being cleared and reused. And if you don't resolve that, your log is going to fill up and grow and fill up and grow, and you have a runaway transaction log. And that's a very common issue that accidental and junior DBAs run into. And that'll just keep on going until you run out of disk space. So you can see that this guy right here has an active transaction, and his transaction log is full, and he's going to grow. And that's not a good thing to have going on. It's also, this shows you what's going on with your compatibility level. And with SQL Server 2014 and newer, this compatibility level setting is really important because it affects whether or not you're using the new cardinality estimator. And the new cardinality estimator works quite well most of the time, but sometimes it has a very severe performance regression. So some queries will get much, much slower because of it. And so this is one way of controlling that. There's also trace flags you can turn on and some other things in SQL Server 2016 at the server level that you can do it at the database level too. And so it's nice to know what's going on with that. Now, you should have all your databases set to checksum for their page verify option. And then there's a lot of other stuff here about statistics, whether or not auto create stats is on, auto update stats asynchronously. And then you can also see a lot of other things here, like where you're using forced parameterization, whether you're using snapshot isolation, read committed snapshot isolation. Two ones that should never ever be on are auto close and auto shrink. Those are both really evil. And then you can also see whether or not this database is a publisher and replication, and see whether they're using transparent database encryption. So a lot of good stuff you see about all your databases here. Okay, now this next one is the infamous missing indexes query. And the reason I say it's infamous is so many people lose their minds and do really bad things based on this. This is very useful to find what the query optimizer thinks are missing indexes that would be useful for its workload, but a lot of junior DBAs and developers run this and then they go crazy and add 50 or 100 new indexes, and pretty much that's almost always a bad idea. What you want to do when you run this is, remember I talked about it's important to understand how long SQL Server's been running, a few hours or a few days versus weeks or months. That has an effect on the magnitude of this number. This index advantage number is a calculated number that tells you cumulatively how important this index might be. And so larger numbers are more important here. And you also want to look at the last user seek date and time. Was it just from a few minutes ago or a few seconds ago, or is it days or weeks ago? Because if it's only from a few minutes or seconds ago, that means that whatever's generating this is part of your normal workload probably. And if it's from 2 or 3 weeks ago, it's probably some ad hoc query or reporting query that's not run very often. Then you want to scroll over here and see what the average user impact percentage is. And this can go up to 100%. And this is the percentage that the cost of the query would be reduced if it had this index according to the query optimizer. The next column that's important is the average total user cost. And this is a relative number. And so higher numbers are more expensive. But this is trying to represent how expensive it is to not have the index that SQL Server is asking for. And then finally, you want to look at the user seeks. That's how many times SQL Server has wanted that index. So after you look at all these, you start to get an idea of how important this potential new index might be. And then before you go and create the index, you want to look and see what's going on with the existing indexes on that table. And then you also finally, you want to take a look and see, quite often you'll see that SQL Server is asking for multiple indexes on the same table. And many times you can combine 2 or 3 or 4 of the ones that it's asking for into one larger, wider index that covers all of those. So it's better to have one wide index instead of 3 or 4 narrow indexes. So those are the kind of things you want to think about. And the worst thing you can possibly do is run this and then turn around and create every single index that it asks for. That's always a bad idea. Okay, and the next one in this set is I want to find out what's going on with my virtual log files, VLFs. And every time your SQL Server log file grows, you get a certain number of VLFs added to it. And how many are added depends on how big the growth was. And they changed the algorithm for that in SQL Server 2014, so it's a little bit better than it used to be. But what goes on here, if you have the default settings for auto grow turned on, and you get lots of small growths in your log file over time, your VLF count gets really high. And if your VLF count is really high, it can affect your write performance of the log file, but more importantly, it makes the recovery portion of a database restore take a lot longer. And that comes into play every time you start SQL Server, because all your databases have to go through crash recovery. So that makes the databases take longer to come online, and it takes a full database restore and recovery process, makes it take longer. And it makes your failovers take longer on a traditional failover cluster because you have to start SQL Server on the new node and then go through crash recovery for all of these. All right, the next one in this set is I want to find out which databases on this instance are using the most CPU on the instance. And so when I run this, it shows me that, hey, this AdventureWorks LT 2008 R2 database is the biggest offender. So if I was under CPU pressure on the instance level, then now I know which database is the biggest culprit. And that's really good to know, so you can start drilling into that database later. The same way for the next query that looks at which database is using the most I/O cumulatively. And this query, again, is not just your regular workload, but it includes backups and index maintenance and DBCC check DB. But you can see that this database is the biggest offender by far. So it's a different one for I/O than we saw for CPU. And then the next one in the set does the same thing, but it looks at buffer pool usage. So this is showing you which databases on your instance are using the most memory in the buffer pool. And this one can take a few seconds on a real instance, but you can see that this database is using the biggest chunk of memory in my buffer pool by far. So if I was under memory pressure, now I know who the biggest culprit was. All right, the next one in the set is the cumulative weight stats query, and this is another one that's often misinterpreted and misused. And this is going to look at the top weight stat types since SQL Server has been running, or since somebody's cleared the weight stats with that command that I have above. And so this shows you your top weight types, and over here it shows you the weight percentage for each one of these weight types. And then it shows you the average weights in seconds for resource weights, and then for signal weights. And signal weights are related to CPU, and resource weights or anything else. So by looking at this can point you in one direction or another to do more investigation. But what you don't want to do is run this query and then find a particular weight type like CX packet weights and Google it. And then do the first thing that you find on your Google search based on that. That's called knee-jerk performance tuning. And it's a really bad idea because, first of all, there's a lot of bad advice on the internet, number one. And number two, you want to do some more investigation, and it may turn out that what you see here might be a little bit deceptive, and maybe there's some other things going on that you want to try to understand before you just start changing settings and tuning queries based on this query alone. And where this query is helpful, though, is if your server is running poorly and everybody's complaining like they like to do, why is the database so slow? This will help point you in one direction or another. But again, don't just go crazy and start changing things willy-nilly just by running this one query. And one thing I want to point out is Paul Randall, my boss, has a really good SQL Server weight types library that he's working on and extending all the time that documents these weight types and what they mean and what, if anything, you want to do if you see that particular weight type. Okay, the next one in the set is I want to find out what's going on with my SQL Server connections. And this will show me how many connections I have from each IP address. The next one is giving my average task counts. And so this is going to change from second to second. If you see this above 10, the average task counts per scheduler, that usually either means your server is really busy or you're seeing lots of blocking and deadlocking. If you see this above 0 runnable task counts, that's a pretty good secondary indicator of CPU pressure. And then this also is a good indicator of I/O pressure if it's above 0. Yeah, and there's no way I'm going to finish this on time, so I'm going to try to get through the instance level ones, and then we'll probably just stop. But anyways, the next one, if you see high average task counts and you think you might be seeing blocking, this one will give you an indicator of who's blocking who. And it'll point you, hopefully, to help get to the root cause of your blocking issues. All right. The next one shows them my CPU utilization in 1-minute increments for the last 256 minutes. So this gives me an idea that, hey, SQL Server has been pretty bored the last while since I've been blabbering here. But if you see your processor's pegged at 100%, you can find out it's been going on for the last 5 minutes or the last 4 hours by running this, even if you don't have any other monitoring tools in place. So if you did see high CPU time and CPU pressure, running this would tell you which queries across the entire instance we're using the most CPU. So now I know this database has a query that's really expensive for CPU, total worker time. And you can see the numbers dropping off really quickly. All right, page life expectancy. This is a good indicator of internal memory pressure, and you want this number to be as high as possible, but don't just run this query once and think that everything's good or everything's bad. You want to run this periodically and get an idea of what your range is and what the trend is. All right, the next one in the set is memory grants pending, and this is a perfmon counter. And if you see this above 0 and you want to run it multiple times, if you ever see this above 0, that's SQL Server screaming bloody murder that it's under memory pressure. And you do not want to see that. All right, the next one is, okay, looks like I am under memory pressure. Who's using the memory? So if I run this memory clerk query, this tells me which clerks are using most of the memory. And with SQL Server 2012 and newer, this is a new memory clerk, SQL buffer pool. That's what you want to be using your memory. But what you might see is this one, cache store SQL CP. That's your ad hoc and prepared plan cache. And you don't want that to be using a lot of memory. So turning on optimize for ad hoc workloads will help control that. And also there's a command you can run called dbcc, the free system cache SQL plans that will help clear those out periodically. All right, so if you did see high values for that, you can run this query to find out who the culprits are. And when you do this, you can copy the query text and then go talk to the developer who wrote the bad ad hoc query. And here's the command I was talking about, dbcc free system cache SQL plans. You can run that periodically with an agent job to flush that particular plan cache. So if you are under memory pressure, you can see which queries across the entire instance are causing it with this. All right. Then if you just want to see which queries are taking the most time across the entire instance, and this is where you can look like a superhero. Find that query that takes 30 seconds and tune it to come back in less than a second, and everybody thinks you're a super genius. And this one takes a few seconds to come back, but it'll show you, which queries are taking the highest average elapsed time, and these times are in microseconds, not milliseconds. All right, and then you can look at user-defined function execution statistics. This is a new one for SQL Server 2016. Scalar user-defined functions have major performance problems quite often, and this will show you, okay, this database has a UDF, and here's his stats. So that's nice to know. You can go find the developer who wrote this and say, what are you doing? Here, let's change it to a stored procedure. All right, so that is the instance level queries, and there's just no way that I'm going to make it through the rest of these. There's 80 queries in the set. So I guess what I can do now is, see if we have any questions. But hopefully you've seen that these are very useful for telling you how your instance is configured and how it's performing. And the rest of these ones in the set, we would switch to a particular database and start running these to find out what's going on inside of this database. So let's see if there's actually any questions.
I'm not sure if you answered this one during the session. We had a question about whether or not any of these could be used with Azure, and I looked up on your blog and it sounded like you were going to do something about that, but it wouldn't be exactly the same. But I'll let you answer that. Sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, a few months ago I was promising to come out with a version for Azure, and I just haven't gotten to that yet. A lot of these ones, especially the ones we've gone over now, would not work in Azure because, pure Azure SQL database abstracts away most of this stuff from you, and all you just work with databases that you create. Now, if you were running Azure in a VM, these would all work exactly the same. But Azure SQL DB, many of these would not work. And soon, hopefully in the next month or two, I'll have a version of these for Azure SQL DB.
Okay, that's good. It'll just be one more for you to keep updated all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
Some scripts are reading from the error log, and what's the best practice to recycle the error log since some of the data might not be available for the scripts?
That's a good question. I mean, a lot of people do not recycle the error log, and a new one gets generated whenever they start SQL Server, but some people have policies where they recycle it fairly often. That sort of depends. I mean, the first thing I think you should do is change the default setting to keep more than 6 error logs. And then if you're generating a lot of error log activity, you can go in and recycle it periodically. But that really depends on your workload and how much it's filling up. And if you turn on that trace flag 3226, your error log will not fill up nearly as quickly because it won't have all that stuff about your successful database backups.
We have that trace flag turned on, and we go in and change the default to something like 30 days, and then we recycle it every night with a job. So on a lot of our servers, so that usually works out.
Way of doing it.
Okay, I'm going through these. A lot of these questions are just, like I said, praising the scripts, wanting to know where to get the scripts. So we've been handling those. So that's another awesome. How can we leverage your DMVs for performance baselines?
Well, I mean, one thing that I did a few years ago is I wrote a blog post that has a script that if you run it, it'll create a little database called Server Monitor, and it creates an agent job that runs once a minute by default. And it collects about 7 instance level metrics and stores them in that little Server Monitor database. And you can easily extend that. And so that's one thing you could do, just monitor some of the important things you're worried about automatically. Or, you know, what I'll do is I'll just run this complete set on an instance and then come back later and do it again periodically and just keep a record of that and compare over time what's been going on with it. So there's lots of different ways of doing it.
Okay, what is that I should worry about? Example is backups. Okay. Okay, they're basically saying if you're on Azure SQL DB isn't the selling point, you don't need to worry about this. Are there some things that we would still need to take care of that Microsoft wouldn't if you're on SQL?
Yeah, I mean, with Azure SQL DB, you're working with your database. And so all the instance level stuff and hardware level stuff is not going to be something you have any control about or worry about. But other things like, you know, which queries are most expensive, and do you need to create indexes, you know, things like that you do have to worry about. So you don't just sit there and do nothing. There's other things you have to worry about, but it's just for your database. So all the database level ones that I didn't get to are the ones that are going to be relevant for Azure SQL DB. Plus there's a few Azure specific ones that I'll be able to add that aren't in this set at all.
Okay, this user is wanting to know something about the access required to run these scripts.
Okay, well, you need what's called view server state permission for most of these. And so if you're an administrator, a SQL administrator, you'll have that. If you want other people to do it and you don't want to give them that level of access, you can just grant view server state to a particular login or group, and then they'll be able to run most of these queries.
Okay, this user's talking about SQL restarts, and a lot of things are lost. Do you have, maybe on a monthly basis, do you have recommendation for queries that would be good for sending to a table for longer term review?
Well, that thing that I mentioned earlier with the Server Monitor database, if you create that, then every minute you're going to be collecting about 7 things like your CPU utilization, your page life expectancy, your task counts. And the ones that I collect, I think, are a good baseline, because just by looking at that, I can have a pretty good idea how SQL Server is running and what it's most unhappy about. And so I think that's a good starting point. And you can always add more to that yourself if there's certain things you're particularly concerned about. So maybe there's a particular store procedure that you're really concerned about how long it takes to run. And so you could track that, for example, whatever you feel like adding to it.
So basically, they could Google Glenn Berry SQL Monitor DMV and probably come up with the blog post that you had. Get the details on how to set that up.
Right, and I think somewhere in this script I have a link to the blog post where you can grab that script. But otherwise, just send me an email, Glenn at SQL Skills, and I'll find that and get it to you or give you the link.
Okay, and people are still wondering, but basically, if you go to Glenn's, if you Google Glenn Berry DMV query downloads, it'll go to his blog, and then just go into the very first entry he has.
Yeah, and I update these each month. I mean, I updated these for April just a couple days ago. And believe me, if you just Google Glenn Berry DMV, you'll go right to, we've got a category for under my blog, and it'll take you right to all of these. And then you just go there and make sure you get the version that matches your version of SQL Server. That's a real common issue where, say somebody's running SQL Server 2008 R2 and they grab the SQL Server 2014 version, and a lot of queries just don't work.
Oh, did I just my VoIP has been going in and out. Did I just go out there for a second?
Yeah, I think you did, because I didn't hear anything from you. But
okay, sorry about that. I'm back.
Okay.
What is there a DMV to see what's in line for processing, especially when it comes to parallelism? I guess they're wanting to go see the queues.
Well, I mean, you can run Atom Mechanics SP who is active. I don't know. There's other ones you could run to try to figure that out. But yeah, I don't have one in my set. Well, I do sort of have one. There's a new thing they added in SQL Server 2016 SP1 right here, input buffer information. So instead of running DBCC input buffer and giving it a SPID number, you can run this query and it'll show you everything for all of your SPIDs, the most recent command that was sent to it. So that's part of that answer at least.
Okay, I like that. Performance blogs, how to do some very basic. Okay, somebody posted your, and I'll copy it. Somebody posted the blog post, and let me send that out to everybody real quickly. And have you thought about adding your DMV queries to Microsoft's performance baseline solution?
No, not really. Nobody's ever asked me that before. No, I haven't.
Okay. They didn't do a follow-up, so great script. Thank you for the presentation.
Well, and one thing I want to point out while you're perusing the questions is I've got 3 Pluralsight courses that talk about these queries in more detail, and they're each about an hour long. And then you can go get a Pluralsight pass for free from Microsoft. If you go and join the Visual Studio Dev Essentials program, you'll get a 3-month pass. And then if you join this program, the IT Pro Cloud Essentials program, you get another 3-month pass plus some other cool stuff. So you can watch Pluralsight for 6 months for free and hopefully watch all my courses, but you know, it's not going to cost you any money to do that.
People should do that. They should just listen to what you just said, because Pluralsight is fantastic anyway. I mean, SQL Skills got 50 or 60 courses out there themselves, but they definitely need to do that. Let's see. Okay. Sorry.
Yeah, there's 80 queries in this set, and I'm sorry, I mean, I just, no way I could get through them in the time we have, but hopefully you see some value here.
Oh, a lot of people are saying that they definitely want to, they see value, and they're definitely wanting to get the scripts. So about half the questions are just about the scripts, and we've already announced you can Google Glenn Berry DMV query downloads, and you'll go to his blog, and you can just click on any of his posts. He has the very latest, greatest links for every version out there. Okay. That's about it. That's about it. That's the detailed questions. Wait, here's one more.
Now here's the April one, and so this is where you get, you know, for VNext, the actual queries, and then I have a blank results spreadsheet that goes with it. So here's all the different ones for April, and these get updated every month. And then the older versions that are out of support, I only update every few months. So that's where they live, right here.
Okay. One person had a question, and this is the last one. Do you know where I can find the PowerShell scripts for your DMV queries?
Uh, no, not really. I mean, I've just had different people tell me over the years that they're doing this. So, yeah, I would say that Google and Bing are your friend. There's some people that have written blog posts on how to automate my queries. So, yeah, sorry about that. But anyways, I appreciate everybody who came and listened to me, and I appreciate you guys giving me a chance to speak for you all.
Well, we loved the presentation, and I'm going to go back and dig into it again, in addition to doing it on Pluralsight. But thank you. I think you wanted to know, we probably had close to 350. I'll know the exact number afterwards. So we
Okay.
had a real good turnout. Anyway, thanks, and I'm going to try to send as many people to watching you in the session next Monday down under. It'll be next Monday for um, for everybody in the U.S. It'll be the next day for people in Australia. But thanks, and I really appreciate it. Send us questions if you have any comments about anything, and we'll try to answer them, or send Glenn comments. And get those free passes to Pluralsight. That's definitely worth it. Go back and listen to the video. We'll post this in a couple of days, and we'll post the links ourselves also to where to get his scripts, because I know you're going to want to play with these scripts and go through the video again. Thanks. Bye.
All right. Thanks a lot.